Hey, welcome back everybody. In today's video, we're gonna learn about priority placement groups within Azure, which is essentially, well, before I tell you what it is, let this intro bumper play while you're hitting subscribe. 3, 2, 1. Hey everybody, welcome back. Mike here. So happy to be with you today. As I said before, we're gonna talk about priority placement groups within Azure today. As we start this conversation, I wanna first talk about what they are, and then we'll get into Azure and we'll actually see how it works. Now, what is a priority placement group? In a nutshell, it's a feature that allows two VMs within Azure or multiple VMs to be placed physically closer together. This would be, if you're familiar with VMware, this would be kind of the same concept of affinity rules. So if we draw this out, let's say, so again, we're talking about Azure. I just used the VMware example so that if you're familiar, that's kind of the idea. But let's say we have Azure. So we have, I'm gonna say this is region B. I always draw these things backwards. I don't know why I do that. Let's see, region A. Okay. So let's say we have, I want to think about this. Let's say we have two VMs and they're part of the same application. Well, we could put one here and we could put one there, right? And they would have to talk between regions that are geographically separated, right? So what happens when we are very separated? Latency, right? It takes a long time for packets to go back and forth. And that results in delay of our application, a poor user experience, that sort of thing. So that's not ideal. So the next option is maybe we could say, if instead of doing this, maybe we say, let's just put two VMs in the same region. That's great. That's an improvement, right? They're in the same region now. Now the problem is, keep in mind, we have the concept of availability zones. They could end up physically in separate availability zones. So they could be in the same region, say the East US, but they could be separated by a reasonably large amount of distance, even within the same region. So I guess the next solution would be if we just kind of wipe this blank, we have, again, now we're just looking at region B. And again, we have, I'll just draw this out, we'll say availability zone 1, availability zone 2, and availability zone 3. If you're a little rusty on availability zones, I actually did a great video for it. Well, I don't know if it's great. I mean, I meant to say I did a video on it, but yes, I have a high opinion of that video. I didn't know that. But either way, there's a video I did on it that talks about availability zones and regions that will help clear up any doubts you might have. But the point is, what we could do, obviously, is we could say, well, you know what? The common sense thing is let's put both of those VMs in the same availability zone. Well, that certainly solves a big part of our problem because now we don't have this scenario where traffic is going back and forth between availability zones and we have additional latency. Now, I do want to point out this specific issue is really more noticeable for applications very sensitive to latency. Will a normal application, just standard usage, nothing crazy, will it really matter if we split it across AZs? Probably not in most cases, but if your app is very sensitive to latency, this matters. So again, we could manually, place the VMs when we create them, we could place them together in AZ-1. That solves the problem, right? But here's the real problem. And I want to draw this out one more time. I want you to keep in mind, so now we're zoomed in, so now we're only looking at AZ-1. We have, our first VM here. We have our other VM here. Okay, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that an availability zone is made up of what? It's not necessarily one data center. An availability zone would actually have several data centers, right? So in this case, we still have the same issue, right? These VMs are still communicating across separate data centers. All right, so now that we framed the problem that these placement groups are going to solve for us, how do they actually work? Well, in our last drawing, I know I said that already once, essentially what happens is we will create these placement groups and we'll create it and we'll call it, my app or something like that. right? And what will happen is now when we create our VMs, we will specifically reference that same placement group. And the net result of that is that in one of those data centers, both of those VMs will be deployed. So essentially, this is a way of sort of pinning those VMs into the same data center together. And again, this could be multiple VMs, not just two. It could be 3, 4, 5, whatever. But that's the idea. Now, there are some slight nuances to this, and we're not going to get too far into the weeds there, but I do want to get into the portal and show you what this looks like. So let's check it out. All right, so here we are inside of Azure. Now in this case, I have 3 VMs that we're working with. I have test VM B, test VM C, and test VM Y. And I want to focus in just to give you kind of a lay of the land. These 2 VMs are stopped. This one is running currently. Now, the reason I have this set up is one of the prerequisites to placing a VM in a placement group is the VM has to be stopped deallocated. If you're not familiar with the difference between stopped and stopped deallocated, I also did a video on that as well, so you should definitely check that out. But in this case, it makes sense because if it's running, it's on hardware somewhere, right? So we have to stop it so we can deallocate it and then spin it up wherever, you know, the placement group lands, right? And we don't have power over saying I want the placement group to spin up in data center 1 in AZ-1, right? That's beyond our view. But the whole point of it is that wherever it does spin up, that our VMs in the group will start up together. All right, so we've got that done. Now I want to show you first where to find the config for the placement group. So if we go into test VM B and we go to configuration under settings, it's going to be right here, proximity placement group right here. And it says none currently. Since it's stopped, I do have one created. We'll create one together, but I do have one already created. If you click the drop down, you'll see it's called PPG. Now, if I select PPG for this one, and actually I'll just do it while we're here. I'll hit apply. We'll give that a second. And then we'll go over to test VMC while we're here. And same thing here. So under this one says none. Let's go ahead and add that to PPG and hit apply. So what I've essentially done is test VM B and C will come online when I start them in the same data center, which is the whole point of the placement group. Now, let's go to test VM Y. And the reason I want to go there is because of this. See how it's grayed out? And it actually says, let's see, priority or proximity placement group can only be updated when the virtual machine is deallocated. So it's telling us I just can't do it. So in this case, let's go to the overview for this VM. Let's stop this VM real quick. We'll give that a minute and we'll come back to this one and I want to see if I can show you something. I'm not sure if it'll work, but we'll try it. All right, so that one is stopping. So you saw me add those 2 VMs to the placement group, but Mike, how did where did the placement group come from? Where did PPG, where'd that come from? Well, essentially what we can do is go to the search bar here, we can type in proximity placement groups. We'll click that right there. And we see we have PPG here. Now I'm going to show you what it looks like to create it. And I don't know if we'll completely finish it. We might as well, I guess. But let's go ahead and click create right here. All right, so the first thing we do is specify our standard information like the subscription, the resource group. I will place this in the same resource group as the test VMs. For the proximity placement group, I keep calling it priority. It's the most annoying thing ever. I've always done that, by the way, ever since that came out. I'll just say test PPG. And then for region, obviously I want to specify the same region that I want my VMs in. So we're gonna leave this to East US. Now, this is one thing I wanna mention. So this intent details, so this is where we can specify, if I click this dropdown, we can specify what kind of VMs do we want to be allowed to be in the PPG, in the proximity placement group. Now, the reason for this, and it's kind of interesting actually, not all hardware in the Azure data center supports all of the VM sizes. So if there is, 100 servers, just throwing it out there, right? Maybe 10 of them will support, again, I'm picking one at random, standard B2S. But maybe 90 of them will support the rest of these. So that's really the reason behind this. So in my case, I'll just, again, just for the sake of demonstrating, maybe we select a couple. We then specify zone preference. We do have the choice of where do we want to put these workloads. When they come up, do we want them to fire up inside of zone 1, 2, 3, whatever, or do we not have a preference? And I don't really care because all I care about is that they come up together. That's really it. So if we hit review and create, and validation works, we hit create. That's it. That's the proximity placement group config. And then of course we have to reference it in the VM config, which we already did for the existing one that I had created prior to this video. Okay, so let's go back to our virtual machines. So we have test VM B and C are in that proximity placement group. Let's go into, and actually, you know what, while we're here, I'm gonna go ahead and select both of those, and I'm gonna try to start those. And the reason I said try, some of you might have caught that, why I said, why are you try to start them, just start them. The reason, I'm gonna watch the status on this, the reason is specifically because when we are using proximity placement groups, it's a constraint on the deployment, which means it will try to fire them up together, but the reality is if test VM A and test VM B are not supported on the same hardware, it will fail. So we could actually have a scenario where it does not come up together, they do not power on, and you'll get, I believe it's like an allocation failure or something like that. In this case, it looks like they came up fine, which makes sense because if we look at the size, I did DS1, DS2, these are relatively standard VM sizes within Azure. All right, so let's go ahead, now that it's been a minute, let's go over to test VMY. Let's go into that one, and we're going to head down to configuration, and let's look at the proximity placement group. Let's see what options we have. So we click it, we have PPG, test PPG. Now recall that I picked, and actually I don't, did I? Let's check the size on this one. This one is an E2SV3, which again is relatively standard. So if you were to come to configuration though, and you realize that, you know, hey, I don't see a proximity placement group here, more than likely it's because of the size that you selected for that VM is not okay with that proximity placement group, that PPG. So you would have to go into the PPG and make sure that that VM series is allowed. And not all are listed there, but some will still work anyway. Like actually, I believe DS1, so that's what test VM B and C, that's not even listed in the PPG, but it still works fine. Okay, so that's it. The last thing I'll show you, just a little bonus here, if you are relatively new to Azure, let's say you created a VM and then you realized, hey, it's not working with that specific form factor. If you come into the VM settings, if you go down, I believe it's right here, under availability and scale, if you click on size, you can actually resize the VM here. So if I click like DS1V2, I can hit resize here, and that will just resize the VM for me. Now, obviously you want to be careful and make sure that you're not resizing to a form factor. Like we're going from a relatively large one to a much, much smaller one. You know, in a production environment, you want to be careful about that. But that just wanted to show you guys how to do that if you weren't familiar, because that could come in handy as you create these groups and do some testing. All right, that's all I got for you. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, do myself and yourself a favor, hit the subscribe button. That way you'll get notifications when I drop videos just like this one. So stay safe and healthy, and until next time, stay nerdy.